Hey gorgeous souls, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for joining me for another one of my YouTube videos today. So today's video is a podcast episode from my #1 spirituality podcast on iTunes, Spiritual Queen's Badass Podcast. And today I'm interviewing the wonderful Caggie Dunlop, who is about to become an author, but she's most famously known for being on Channel 4's Made in Chelsea many moons ago, and also known for her Saturn Returns podcast. So in this interview, me and Caggie talk all things Saturn return. What is a Saturn return? How do the planets affect us? A little bit about astrology and what it means to become 30 and the pressures and societal pressures and expectations of aging, being a woman. It was a really, really insightful conversation. Being 29 myself, going through my Saturn return currently, and feeling all these, societal pressures and hitting that big 3-0. This was a great podcast for me alone to learn from Caggie, but I'm sure it's going to inspire so many of you as well. So if you're new here to my channel, then welcome. My name is Emma. I'm an award-winning life coach and mentor, 2 times best-selling author, law of attraction YouTuber here on my channel, host of the #1 spirituality podcast on iTunes, Spiritual Queen's Badass Podcast, and speaker. And here on my channel, you can expect all things law of attraction, manifestation, spirituality, and self-help. And not only do I really hope you're going to enjoy this podcast episode, but all the abundance of videos here on my channel over the last 8 years. And of course, if you want to listen to any more guest interviews just like this, then I have a whole playlist here on my YouTube channel of the video interviews of the podcast with other like-minded spiritual authors, gurus and teachers, which you do not want to miss. We've had some incredible people over the years. And of course, if you want to listen to the full podcast, the audio, and hear my solo cast episodes as well, which are every other week, then you can find my podcast on every platform that distributes podcasts. But without further ado, let's get started. I really hope you're going to enjoy Caggie and I's conversation, and of course all details to Caggie's work is in the description below. So thank you so much guys for joining me for another one of my Spiritual Queen's Badass Podcast episodes. I am so excited to have the gorgeous Caggie Dunlop with us today. So Caggie, if you don't know, is a singer, podcast host of the Saturn Returns podcast and TV personality known for being in Channel 4's Made in Chelsea. The Saturn Returns podcast explores the challenges and opportunities that come with change and our individual quest for authenticity. The podcast aims to bring calm and clarity during times of transition, underpinned by the astrological transit known as your Saturn return. Welcome to the show, Caggie.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, amazing. How are you doing?
I'm good. I just got back from a holiday, which was really lovely, just very quiet family time. And I do feel like, I don't know, when you come back and you're sort of rested and ready to go, but then there's like 1,000 things opening up. I just opened up all my mail and I was like, oh my gosh. But I'm feeling good. Thanks.
You need a holiday from your holiday. I totally get it.
No, I don't. But I'm someone, when I check out, I find it hard to check back in, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And then it's almost like the daunting of the inbox and everything. And you're like, where do I even start?
Exactly. I feel like I get overwhelmed quite easily. So yeah, but it's good. Summer vibes. I'm happy.
Amen to that. Well, I'm so excited to talk all things Saturn return with you today because we haven't actually covered this on the podcast yet. And I'm actually going through my first Saturn return at the moment as well. So I'm so excited to hear all of your wisdom you've got to share with us today. But first of all, before we dive into that, one question I love to ask every guest who comes on is, when did you spiritually awaken? What's your story?
I mean, I always sort of feel that spiritual awakenings are often or sort of run synonymously with rock bottom. So when everyone's like going through a bit of a dark night of the soul, rock bottom, I'm always like, oh, this is an exciting time. So I would say that it was, but it wasn't like one moment. I would say I've always been a spiritual person, but I disengaged from that aspect of myself throughout my 20s, I guess, even as early as my teens, because it just wasn't really encouraged, or it didn't feel like it was I don't know, I didn't feel like I was in a community that really cultivated that. And then when I moved to LA when I was 27, I broke up with someone that I'd been with for a while, and there was sort of a clear trajectory that we could have gone down. And then I just went through this very strange, I guess, dark night of the soul period where I felt very lonely, I felt very confused, I felt very isolated. All the sort of coping strategies I'd had throughout my 20s just weren't sufficing anymore. And yeah, I guess that was sort of my spiritual awakening, but it wasn't one clear moment, it was a collection of moments. And if I were to pinpoint it on one, more concrete moment in time, it was when I actually came back from LA and was still feeling sort of lost in the void. And a friend of mine that I'd been at school with, she was in the year above me, reached out and said she was running these retreats. And she'd invited me on one, and it hadn't felt like the right time to go. And then she invited me on another one, and I was sort of at a bit of a crisis point. So I just thought, okay, why not? And, historically, the retreats I'd been to had been more health conscious, sort of green juices and yoga, which is amazing. And I love those. But this was not like that. And this was not what I expected. And I really resisted when I first got there, because I felt my ego kind of took over and was like, I don't want to be here. This is not for me. It was a sort of deep dive into, shadow aspects of yourself, personal development on steroids. And I, eventually surrendered to it. And that was probably a big, big turning point for me.
I love that. And like you say, your Saturn return was that key moment where you thought, right, what's happening? It's all coming to the forefront. It's all coming up. Like you said, you made that big move. You've come back. So it feels like so much happened in that time frame, and so many pivotal things. And I feel like when I first started hearing about Saturn returns, there was always like this fear behind it. It always seems like big things are going to happen and like big changes. And I think for some people it definitely can be, and it can be really like almost like life truck moments where it's sliding doors, and like you say, whether it's a relationship ending, whether it's moving, whether it's discovering yourself, healing, inner work coming up. It feels really like a lot of us, well, all of us obviously go through this, but it feels like a lot of us really do have these big shifts and changes. So it's amazing that that was your collective awakening as such, and that's brought so much incredibleness to your work as well, because now you obviously teach it, which is awesome. So
yeah, I mean, I would say so much happened and nothing. It actually, sort of the years preceding my Saturn return, it felt like nothing was happening, and that was part of the problem. So, before we go through our Saturn return, we have our progressed lunar return, which Nora, the astrologer for Saturn return, speaks about this as a sort of a time where a lot of things come undone and a lot of our emotional wounds come to the surface. And in that space, I don't know, it felt like there was a lot of space at that time, a lot of things that I had to process. And then my Saturn return, it was sort of like prepares you for your Saturn return. And my Saturn return itself was like, it fell over the time of a relationship, actually. And that was when everything then suddenly sped up, sort of, after that. Yeah.
Makes sense. And I didn't know about the kind of what did you call it, the lunar
Progressed lunar return. Yeah.
I didn't know about that, but that makes total sense even for myself. Like when you were saying that, I was like, oh my God, that definitely happened for me as well. So incredible. Well, let's get on to the good stuff then. So what is a Saturn return, and when did you first learn about this?
So a Saturn return is something that happens when Saturn, the planet, returns to the same place in the sky it was when you were born. So if you look at your birth chart, and if you can see where Saturn is, and Saturn as a planet takes about 30 years to orbit back to that place in the sky. So people often say, oh, can my Saturn return come early, or can it be coming late? And no, it doesn't really work like that, because the way planets move is mathematical in that sense. You can't rush it or slow it down. And they say in astrology, Saturn is a planet. I mean, it's got a sort of perhaps like negative connotation because it's about karma, it's about responsibility, it's about discipline. It's associated with the father, so it's got quite a lot of authority around it. And your Saturn return is kind of viewed as, people are like Saturn phobic about it because it can abruptly change everything in your life. And people, it's a very turbulent time. But my whole philosophy on it is like, it's the ultimate teacher, and it's only there to encourage you to be I don't want to say the best version of yourself, because I feel like that gets used so much, but it kind of strips away what's not meant for you. And it also strips away the way you've been behaving or living, or patterns that aren't actually in your best interest. And I think we all, through life, through trauma, through experiences, we just pick up these patterns of behaving and these defensive strategies for life that actually can be quite, counterproductive to our happiness. And so I always think Saturn kind of brings those things to the forefront, so we actually have to face the obstacles or face our demons head on. So yeah, your Saturn return, it lasts for about 2.5 years. It's supposed to be, it's like a cosmic coming of age where we get a bit of perhaps a rude awakening into adulthood if we have not been living in a Saturnian fashion so far. So for some people, if they are, depending on their chart and depending on how they've been living for the last 30 years, if it's a sort of reap what you sow situation. So if you've been disciplined, living authentically, it can mean a promotion, it can mean marriage, solidifying what's already at play. But if you have been living more recklessly, which I say I was, it can be a bit of a shock to the system, let's say.
I think that's a really good way to put it, a shock to the system. And I think as well, like you say, there's quite a lot of fear-based stuff out there sometimes. I know when I first started hearing about it was like, ooh, your life's going to be turned upside down. But like you say, it really depends on where it is in your chart and how you've been living before that. Like I spiritually awakened when I was 23, 24. So for me, I was like, yeah, like what on earth can Saturn teach me by this point? Oh boy, how I was wrong. When I hit 27, it was almost like this clock had struck as such. And just from there, it was like I couldn't go back. And I walked away from a really negative relationship for good. I wanted to work on myself, like tons of inner work came up, trauma came up. I mean, it was literally like as soon as I hit 27, boom. And I didn't really expect it to be that abrupt or like that obvious, but it really, really was. And still now, I'm nearly 2 years into it now. I'm turning 29 next month. I'm still feeling it 100%, not as intense, not as abrupt as such. And like really positive things have happened throughout this time as well. Like I've really come into myself more and really sort of like not grown up as in like grow up, but you know what I mean? Like come into my adult self more.
Yeah.
And,
Absolutely.
who I am.
It's really an initiation into adulthood, but you might have gone through your progressive lunar return and actually going into your Saturn return. And I think from my personal experience that was harder. But you kind of need these, my view is you need these experiences and these, for lack of a better word, hardships in order to be more refined as a person. I think we like this idea that we can just arrive spiritually awakened and like everything just be easy and breezy. And that's the sort of thing, I guess, about my love affair with Saturn, is that actually retrospectively looking back, I can see like all those trouble spots or all those difficult situations were so important and necessary for me, because I just wasn't very Saturnian as a person. I didn't really embody any of those principles very well. And that was, to my own demise often throughout my 20s. And, I think we should always remember that I don't know if, bar perhaps a few, we ever like fully spiritually awaken. I think it's a gradual process of uncovering and discovering and remembering constantly as we go. And I think when we think we have it all figured out, that's usually where shit gets crazy. Like, and the universe will just be like, no, you don't.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like you feel like, right, I've mastered this. The universe is like, right, now let's move on to this next lesson. Definitely. So
well, I think you will see it in relationships when someone's on their own. I've definitely experienced this myself, when you're like, I have everything figured out, I know who I am, blah blah blah, and then you get in a relationship and it's just this mirror to all of this unhealed stuff. And that's why, relationships are the greatest container for our personal development. I'm really against the sort of notion that we have to love ourselves and be content independently before finding another. I actually think relationships, the right ones, obviously, are such a source of healing and growth.
Amen to that. So what is the purpose of a Saturn return, and when do we go through them in life?
So we go through them in your late 20s, depending on your chart, but it will be sort of between 28 and 31. And it lasts for about 2.5 years. Like, I've talked to Nora about this because it gets a little bit confusing as to why it's 2.5 years, because actually, if it retrogrades, it goes out of the house and comes back out of the sign and comes back in. So that's when it gets a little bit more detailed. But I mean, I guess the purpose of it is to initiate into adulthood. We go through Saturn squares and Saturn transits. So if you look back at your life, even though your Saturn return is like the big one, and usually that's where people put the most attention if they know about it, if they're learning about it. But Saturn has seasons and cycles of 7. So much like we do on Earth, their Saturn seasons are 7 years. So if you look back at your life, at those moments, we have 7, 14, 21, they're quite formative, pivotal times where we have, I guess, a visit from Saturn, and we'll bring up the same themes. So like, if you look at authority, which is a big one, when we're 14, we're sort of rubbing up against authority figures in our life, testing the boundaries. We think we have autonomy, or we want it, but we haven't like mastered our own maturity. And then at 21 again, that's when, we can be very rebellious. We think we're adults, we want to be, but also we're just sort of, it's like coming off stabilizers. We don't really know what we're doing. And then your Saturn return, I guess, is your kind of big push. And then you have another one approaching 60, which is the next initiation into the next phase of life. So it's kind of about preparing you for that next stage. And I think whether you look at it astrologically or not, not everyone, but a lot of people I've spoken to, people are very afraid of turning 30. There's a lot of pressure around that. And if we just take off the astrology piece for a moment, within society, especially for women, for men in a different way, but for women in terms of, we have certain expectations that we think we're supposed to meet by 30. And so before our 30th birthday, we often get met with a lot of regret, unrealized expectations, where we thought our life was going to be, and the reality of where it's at. And Saturn is very much about bringing things into reality. So, like Neptune, for example, is very much like fantasy, ethereal realms, whereas Saturn is like grounded. Is it rooted? And so I think that kind of is why we experience that feeling. And then a lot of people say when they're in their 30s, you know, almost as soon as they turn 30, they just suddenly feel this release. Like they're through the other side. And I think that that's the beautiful thing about your Saturn return. And you don't really understand it, I think, until you're through the other side and you have that vantage point to be like, oh yeah, I'm really glad all of that stuff happened, because you want your life to be a sort of A to B straight trajectory, right? And we're like, okay, if I behave this way and that's what I want, I'll just walk towards that, la la la, and I'll get there and that'll be it. And Saturn, or the universe, whatever you want to call it, just kind of will throw a wrecking ball in that path and throw you completely off course. And it's very easy, because I did this a lot at the time, to be in a bit of a victimhood mode about it. But I truly believe that it's actually for your best interest and for your becoming. So you just kind of got to flow with it. I went slightly off topic from what you asked, but
no, but it was amazing because it's so true. And I think, you know, I made my 30 before 30 list a few months ago. And I think even since I've done that, I've like felt this pressure, like you say, of like, oh God, 30. And 100% the societal thoughts have come up for me of like, where should I be? Does that mean I'm going to start aging? Does that mean I'm not like relevant or young anymore? Like all these stupid things, which are so silly, but we all feel. And I think it's a really important reminder of, no matter what age, whether you're going into your second Saturn return and you're turning 60, for example, you know, that comes with, again, even more feelings as you kind of go into that next stage of your life. So yeah, it's great. It's great to hear from your perspective. Obviously, like the fears I'm having, you know, are normal. And that, you know, when I do turn 30, you know, I will be able to look back and be like, right, all of that made total sense. All of that, you know, was absolutely, and I agree, everything happens for the highest good. Everything happens to teach us something or bless us. And I feel like the Saturn return is that ultimate lesson of like, okay, you think you know what you want, let's walk that talk. This is how you're going to get to that place, but it may not be in the way that you think or in the linear fashion, which we all want, like you say, that step A to B process. Sometimes there is a few little curves in the road and ups and downs in that to get where you want to be. So I think that's really, really important. So I'd love to know, Caggie, what was your biggest lesson during your first Saturn return?
I think it was probably that. It was just, you know, I think I was desperately trying to control everything and living from a place of fear. And, you know, to go back to everything you just mentioned about the real pressures of turning 30, now I view it as like, I'm like, okay, how much of these feelings and thoughts mine versus how much of it is conditioning, or, you know, living in the system of the patriarchy, that we have to have these things figured out. And if we don't, we're sort of discarded by society in some way. Because I know that sounds quite dramatic, but I think that's how a lot of women feel. And that's how a lot of the sort of narratives go round. Whereas I try and view it now, I'm like, I can literally do whatever I want, whenever I want. Whereas before I was 30, it felt like the window of opportunity was closing before my very eyes to do all these things, as if like life suddenly narrowed so dramatically when I turned 30 as a woman, that, you know, career opportunities, because that's what we're fed constantly, especially in the entertainment industry. It's like, oh, but you're too old to do that, or like, oh, but you haven't started that, so you can't possibly do it now. Oh, you haven't found a partner, oh, that's going to be really hard. Like, if we actually think about how much of that is fed to us on a daily basis within the media, film, whatever it might be. So it takes a lot of personal sovereignty to actually step away from that and be like, is that actually true? And is that actually true for me? And when you start dismantling that, it can become very empowering. But so to go back to your question, one of the biggest lessons, you know, I was in a relationship at 29, to 30. And I sort of thought, because of, again, what everyone else was doing, it was like, okay, well, timing wise, this is probably it. Even though I felt probably not happy in that relationship, if I'm really honest with myself, we weren't really compatible for each other. And then when that all sort of came crumbling, I just had to kind of relinquish control. I was like, okay, did not see that end coming especially the way that it did. And I just went off on my own and just really was like, I'm just going to invest in my own healing and really commit to myself, and just trust that everything is going to unfold as it's meant to. Because I think that was the first moment as well. And that kind of for me demonstrated that the work that I had done was paying off, because through a lot of my 20s, I lived in a very what if mentality. Like, what if I'd done that instead? I should have taken that road. Why didn't I go down that? Now that opportunity's gone. Now this won't ever happen for me. Constantly berating myself and feeling like a victim of life. And once I realized that and had that self-awareness around it and started doing the necessary work, when my relationship ended, I didn't fall back into that pattern. And that's when I was like, okay. And that for me was like the ultimate test from Saturn. It was like, are you going to go back to that behavior? And it was almost like a lot of people would have just been like, oh, this has happened to me, woe is me sort of thing. But I was just like, no, I'm going to kind of be grateful for this, and I'm just going to move with it. And so I try and maintain that philosophy. I'm not going to say I'm always perfect with it, and sometimes like my self-doubt gets the better of me, but that was probably the biggest thing that I took from it. And to trust in the unfolding of things, even if it's not going in your favor, because it will just be taking you to somewhere you didn't expect or you didn't know was possible. But I do believe that it will be a better place for you.
So true. And I think we always try to control things, don't we? Like, we're such beings of control, whether it's controlling situations, controlling, like you say, of like, I have it all figured out, or controlling over relationships and things like that. And I think Saturn, like you say, is just so important for going with the flow, like being detached, but also optimistic, also, being present and enjoying life, but also living from that place of non-attachment where we're like, okay, I trust that what's for my highest good is going to find me. I trust that what's meant for me will come and will be in my life. But also, we don't know how things could pan out in every single aspect of our life. We can't predict everything. And like you say, I really feel like Saturn is that teacher as such of, you're going to learn to go with the flow. You're going to learn to surrender, and you're going to learn what it means to surrender as a whole. And I think when we can live from that space, like, it's, oh my God, it's so much more freeing when you feel like that weight's been lifted off you and you feel like, okay, I can navigate things from this space better, rather than a space of control and a space of things having to be how you originally thought they were, or how we originally thought they looked. So yeah, I love what you said there, because it's such an important reminder for people. And I think one of my biggest lessons definitely as well.
Really?
Yeah. Surrendering has been continuous. I'm a Virgo sun sign. So.
You're a Virgo. I was going to ask what. Okay, so you like control, like everything. Be just so. My Sydney, who works with me, is a Virgo, so I understand. I love Virgos in my life because I am chaotic and very unorganized. So,
what sun sign are you?
I'm a Taurus.
Interesting.
Taurus, Pisces moon, Libra rising.
Love it. Love it. I'm a Virgo sun, Aries rising, Aquarius moon. So bit of fiery energy behind the Virgo as well, which makes the control sometimes even worse. But yeah, definitely surrendering into it, definitely letting go. So how can we use our Saturn return as a roadmap for life? What are your top tips?
It's a great question. It's my sort of philosophy that your Saturn return is a great opportunity to start cultivating perhaps characteristics or practices or whatever it might be that you didn't embody before. And as much as they will feel very foreign and uncomfortable at the beginning, once we start mastering them and understanding the importance of them, we can begin the journey of self-mastery and, self-actualization. So I think that the key ones for me, and it will be slightly dependent on your chart. So, I highly recommend people go and look up their chart and have a read, because it's just a fascinating thing to get a better insight into yourself, into your psyche. And yeah, if you have your time of birth, that helps a lot as well. But for me, autonomy, authority, responsibility, discipline, emancipation, self-actualization. I would like if I had it a bit more prepared, but those were like the key moments. And I've been writing a book at the moment that I kind of, through just exploring my own journey, I was like, those are the key ones that come out. And although they don't feel they feel quite heavy. Saturn can often feel quite heavy, and a lot of its lessons are. But the sort of paradox with that is actually once we embody them, they create more freedom, they create more creativity. So if we can learn to be disciplined with our day, let's just bring it, into a kind of daily routine, and be mindful with how we're spending our time and our energy, we then can create more space for the things that bring us joy. So that's a sort of, I think as a creative person, I've always romanticized this idea that I just would, have a week to just create. And actually it doesn't really work that way. We need to kind of, because, the reality is we have very real pressures and things that we need to do. So if we can be practical with that and disciplined with our mind, body, spirit, making sure that we're carving out time to do the things that ground us, because again, we live in a culture that's very prone to numbing, whether that's social media, going to the pub, just being around people all the time. I think it's a really important thing to just create a bit of space. And autonomy is ultimately like what we're navigating in our Saturn return. It's like that, ability to stand in our own truth. And that is inevitably going to be a painful thing, because we might be in a community or friendship circles that don't feel empowering anymore, that don't encourage us to be authentically ourselves. And there's a lot of pain in that, because we have to step into the unknown. We have to leave who we thought we were, the community we thought we belonged to. And there's a real threat in that, because as human beings, we need a sense of belonging. We need tribes. So I think trusting that we will find our community, but also to have the strength to embark on a path that's perhaps looks a little lonely in order to do that. And authority is like such a big theme, because, and that kind of ties into emancipation from perhaps family figures, because, we all have complex family dynamics. We all have families. And they play such a big role in this, because we're so programmed to please our families, or to, our behavior is modeled on theirs, whether that's conscious or otherwise. And so when we address that, we can authorize ourselves to behave differently, to have a different model. And that is challenging, because so much of it is just programmed into us from such a young age. And yeah, to take responsibility for ourselves. That is when we step out of victimhood mentality and actually take ownership over our lives and the role we play in everything. it can be very empowering, but it's not without its difficulties, because when we take responsibility, we realize that the blame has nowhere to fall but onto us. When we take responsibility for ourselves, we also have to take responsibility for the consequences of our actions. We can't project them or deflect them onto other people. So, all things run even. And I think with all these things, there's like a lot of hard lessons within them. But I think when we navigate it and we come out the other side, we hopefully are a more refined, truthful version of ourselves, which is both evolving into something, but also coming back home to something that was always there.
I love that. Beautiful. Thank you for those top tips. And yeah, I feel like that returning back to home is so important, because like you say, throughout life we experience limiting beliefs, fears, traumas, experiences, all that detach us from our truth, from unconditional love, from our true essence. And like you say, that Saturn's almost like bringing it all back in and being like, remember who you are. Like, how can you become, like you say, that refined version of yourself that is living more authentically and does feel truer to you and your version of what your best life looks like, or what your manifestations and desires look like. So I can't wait for the book now. That sounds really exciting. When's it out?
I haven't actually announced it, but I keep talking about it because it's such a long process, the whole thing, but it will be out early next year.
Amazing.
But I'll be announcing it soon.
Well, my last question to you today then, Caggie, is what is one piece of life advice that you'd like to leave my lovely listeners with today?
The only wrong step is not taking one. This is something that I kind of learned the hard way, because throughout my 20s, I became in a sort of paralyzing state of not knowing what direction to go in. And so I didn't go in any direction at all. I sort of stood motionless and frozen for a while. And that created a lot of pain, because it made me feel like I was being left behind. And the truth is, like, we're all going at our own paces, our own directions. And that's something that's hard as we leave the sort of structure of school, of university, even, careers in our early 20s, they kind of are on an even keel. And then everyone just kind of goes off in different momentums. So what I would encourage your listeners to do is just try things out, to not feel like a paralyzing sense of what if it's the wrong thing to do, because I believe that if we can kind of learn to dedicate ourselves to something, it doesn't matter if it's not right. It will reveal itself to not be right, but then it will show you what is right for you. And ultimately we need to cultivate those kind of principles, because we can't just like land on it straight away. So even if you feel like you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, just know that you'll be learning something very beneficial from it. And just take that leap of faith, or that little step, whatever it might be, because it's all about the experiences and it's all about the journey at the end of the day.
Love it. It's all about the journey, not the destination. Beautiful. So where can my lovely listeners find you, Caggie, if they want to learn more about your work and your podcast?
So if they want to listen to the podcast, they can find Saturn Returns with Caggie on all streaming platforms. And we have a live show happening at the end of the summer on the 3rd of September in London at Cadogan Hall. And yeah, they can follow me on Instagram at Caggie's World, Saturn Returns Co. on Instagram as well. And yeah, thanks for having me.
And I will put clickable links to Caggie's work in the description below, so you've got some nice, easy, accessible links too. But thank you so much, Caggie, for coming on today. It's been such a joy speaking to you. I've learned so much from this about my own Saturn returns, so I can't wait for the book to come out next year. And yeah, thank you so much for coming on. It's been so great.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
So thank you so much, gorgeous souls, for watching. I really hope you enjoyed that interview, and I really appreciate all your views and likes. Don't forget to subscribe if you're new here, because I would love to see you again soon. Don't forget to leave me a comment in the comments box down below, because I replied to them all. And don't forget you can join my free Law of Attraction support group over on Facebook, where you can join myself and other like-minded souls, where we talk all things Law of Attraction and spirituality. I hope you have a fantastic week, whatever you are up to, and I'll see you all in my next video, which will be on Friday. Lots of love.